The night sky ignited with shots fired, shattering the peaceful silence of Stillwater, Oklahoma, as a gang of riders thundered through the Novak family orchard, their horses' hooves trampling newly blooming apple trees while a lone figure in the distance stood immovable against the chaos, determined to protect what wasn't his, but what he'd grown to love. Violet Novak's trembling hands struck the match against the rough wooden box, illuminating her tear-stained face for a brief moment before she touched the flame to the lantern wick. It was her wedding night, or it should have been. But instead of celebrating with her new husband, she was lighting lanterns to guide him home from wherever he had disappeared to just hours after their vows. "They're coming through again," she whispered to herself, the warm glow of the lantern casting long shadows across the porch of her family's farmhouse. Another lantern lit, and another, until a row of golden beacons lined the wraparound porch. In the distance, she could make out the silhouette of Roy Anderson, the cowboy who worked her father's land, standing firm at the edge of the property, rifle in hand. It was 1878, and the Oklahoma Territory was still wild, untamed, and dangerous, especially for a woman alone. Violet adjusted the simple white dress she'd been married in earlier that day. Her new husband, Thomas Whitaker, had kissed her at the altar, celebrated briefly at their modest reception, then disappeared with a vague explanation about taking care of some business. That was 6 hours ago, and now night riders were cutting through her family's orchard again, just as they had for the past 3 nights. She gripped the final unlit lantern and stepped off the porch, moving toward the orchard despite her better judgment. The sound of hooves grew louder as Roy's voice carried across the property. "You boys best turn around," he shouted, his stance unwavering. "This is private land and I'm authorized to defend it." Violet quickened her pace, the unlit lantern swinging at her side. Her wedding day had turned into a nightmare, but she was determined to face it with the same strength she'd always shown. Her parents had left 3 days ago to visit her ailing grandmother in Kansas, trusting her wedding would be joyous and safe. They couldn't have predicted this chaos or Thomas's disappearance. As she neared the orchard's edge, she saw Roy more clearly now. Tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette was unmistakable even in the darkness. At 28, he'd worked the Novak land for nearly 5 years, becoming more like family than hired help. Tonight, he stood between danger and the bride he'd watched marry another man just hours earlier. "Miss Violet, get back to the house." Roy called out when he spotted her approaching, his voice tight with concern. "I won't hide while our orchard is destroyed," she replied, lifting her chin defiantly. At 22, Violet Novak was known throughout Stillwater for her quiet determination and fierce loyalty to her family's land. The lantern in her hand remained unlit as she came to stand beside Roy. The riders, 5 of them, slowed their approach when they noticed Violet. Their faces were obscured by bandanas, but their intentions were clear. They had been terrorizing local farms for weeks, stealing livestock and destroying crops. No one knew why. Well, the lead rider called out, his voice muffled behind his mask. "Looks like the pretty bride's all alone on her wedding night." He laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the night air. "Where's your husband, Mrs. Whitaker? Run off already?" Roy stepped slightly in front of Violet, his rifle raised. "You have 10 seconds to turn around before I start shooting," he warned. There was no tremor in his voice, no uncertainty. Violet felt a surge of gratitude for Roy's presence. She had known him for years, trusted him completely, yet had never truly seen him until this moment, standing against danger to protect her and her family's land. Something stirred within her, something unexpected and confusing, especially on this day of all days. "You willing to die for Novak's land, cowboy?" another rider taunted. Or is it the bride you're protecting? Heard she got married today. Shame about her husband. A chill ran down Violet's spine. What do you know about my husband? She demanded, stepping forward despite Roy's protective arm. The lead rider chuckled, the sound menacing in the darkness. Let's just say he made some poor choices in who he associated with. Gambling debts don't just disappear when you say I do, pretty lady. Roy's body tensed beside her. Violet, go back to the house. Now. But Violet stood her ground. What have you done to Thomas? Instead of answering, the lead rider suddenly spurred his horse forward, followed by the others. They charged straight toward the orchard, veering at the last moment to circle around Roy and Violet, whooping and hollering as they fired shots into the air. Roy fired a warning shot above their heads, causing one of the horses to rear. Next one won't miss, he shouted. The riders circled once more before the leader signaled, and they all thundered off toward the east, their laughter floating back on the night breeze. When they were gone, Violet sank to her knees, the unlit lantern falling from her grasp. They know something about Thomas, she whispered. What did he mean about gambling debts? Roy knelt beside her, his rifle still in one hand while the other hesitantly touched her shoulder. I don't know, Violet, but we're going to find out. He paused, then added gently, you should have stayed in the house. This is my land too, she replied, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. And apparently my husband has secrets I knew nothing about. Roy helped her to her feet, his touch respectful yet comforting. Let's get you back to the house. I'll stay on the porch tonight, keep watch. Tomorrow, we'll ride into town, see if we can find out what's happened to Thomas. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Violet was acutely aware of Roy's steady presence beside her. She had married Thomas Whitaker after a 6-month courtship, believing she knew him well enough to pledge her life to his. Now, hours into their marriage, she was discovering that perhaps she didn't know him at all. Once they reached the porch, Violet turned to Roy. Thank you for staying. I don't know what I would have done if you weren't here. Roy nodded, his eyes serious in the lantern light. I promised your father I'd look after things. That includes you, Miss Violet. It's Mrs. Whitaker now, she reminded him softly, though the name felt strange on her lips. A shadow crossed Roy's face. Yes, madam, he replied, his voice formal suddenly. I'll be right out here if you need anything. Violet lingered a moment longer, wanting to say something more but not knowing what. Finally, she simply nodded and went inside, closing the door behind her. The wedding dress she wore suddenly felt heavy, constricting. She changed quickly into a simple nightgown, then sat at her window, watching Roy's silhouette as he kept vigilant guard on the porch. What had happened to Thomas? And why did those riders seem to know about it? Sleep eluded Violet that night. She dozed fitfully in her childhood bed, the marriage bed upstairs remaining empty. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the night riders cutting through the orchard, heard their taunting words about her missing husband, and felt Roy Anderson's protective presence beside her. When dawn finally broke, Violet rose and dressed quickly in a practical blue dress, pinning her long auburn hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. When she stepped onto the porch, she found Roy already awake, his hat in his hands. Mornin', Miss Violet, he said, quickly correcting himself. Mrs. Whitaker. Violet is fine, she replied, unwilling to claim a married name when her husband had vanished. Did you sleep at all? Roy shook his head. Kept watch. Those riders didn't come back, but I didn't want to take any chances. Thank you. She hesitated, then added, I'd like to go into town this morning, see if anyone knows anything about Thomas. I'll hitch up the wagon, Roy offered immediately. Have you eaten? Violet shook her head. I'm not hungry. You need to eat something, Roy insisted, his concern evident. I can make you some breakfast while you get ready. The domesticity of the offer struck Violet suddenly. Here she was, a bride without a groom, being cared for by a man who worked for her father. Yet there was nothing inappropriate in Roy's manner, only genuine concern. That would be kind, thank you, she conceded. While Roy prepared a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits, Violet gathered her things for the trip into town. She found herself wondering what people would say when she appeared without Thomas. Their wedding had been well attended. All of Stillwater had been there to witness their vows. How would she explain his absence now? Over breakfast, eaten in awkward silence at the kitchen table, Violet finally voiced her fears. What if something terrible has happened to him, Roy? Roy looked up from his plate, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. We don't know that. Maybe he just got caught up in something unexpected. On our wedding night, Violet's voice broke slightly. What kind of man leaves his bride alone on their wedding night? Roy had no answer for that. He simply said, "We'll find him, Violet, one way or another." The ride into town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rumbled along the dusty road. Stillwater was bustling with morning activity when they arrived. Violet felt the curious stares as she and Roy made their way down the main street. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a gruff man in his 50s who had served Stillwater for more than a decade. He looked up in surprise when Violet entered with Roy. "Mrs. Whittaker," he greeted her, his bushy eyebrows rising. "Didn't expect to see you today of all days. Where's that husband of yours?" "That's why I'm here, Sheriff," Violet said, stepping forward. "Thomas disappeared yesterday right after our wedding. I haven't seen him since." Sheriff Miller frowned. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" Violet explained the events of the previous day, including Thomas's vague excuse about business and the night riders who had cut through the orchard. When she mentioned their comments about gambling debts, the sheriff's expression darkened. "I was afraid of this," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "Afraid of what?" Roy asked, stepping closer to Violet protectively. Sheriff Miller sighed heavily. "Your husband," he began, looking at Violet, "has been spending a lot of time at a gambling house just outside of town. Place called the Red Stallion, not the kind of establishment decent folks frequent." Violet felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and shock. "Thomas gambles. I never knew that." "From what I've heard, he's not very good at it either," the sheriff continued. "Word is he owes a considerable sum to Emmett Dawson, the man who runs the place." Roy's expression hardened at the name. "Dawson's trouble always has been." "You know him?" Violet asked, turning to Roy in surprise. "Know of him," Roy clarified. "He's been causing problems in these parts for years. Rumor has it he's behind the night riders too, though nobody's been able to prove it." Violet's mind was reeling. Her husband, the man she'd pledged her life to just yesterday, had a gambling problem severe enough to put him in debt to a dangerous man. How could she not have known? "You think this Dawson has done something to Thomas?" she asked the sheriff, her voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Miller shook his head. "Can't say for sure, but I'll tell you this: if Whittaker owed Dawson money and Dawson sent those riders to your place, it's not a good sign." "We need to go to this Red Stallion," Violet decided, straightening her shoulders. "Absolutely not," Roy objected immediately. "That's no place for a lady, especially not alone." "I won't be alone," Violet countered, looking pointedly at Roy. "You'll be with me." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "I'd advise against that, Mrs. Whittaker. Let me handle this. I'll ride out there today, ask some questions." But Violet was already shaking her head. "With all due respect, Sheriff, this is my husband we're talking about. I need to know what's happened to him." After further discussion, they reached a compromise. The sheriff would accompany Violet and Roy to the Red Stallion, but only after gathering a few deputies as backup. They would meet at the edge of town in 1 hour. As Violet and Roy left the sheriff's office, the whispers began. People on the street stared openly, clearly wondering why the new bride was in town without her groom. Violet held her head high, ignoring the curious glances, but inside she was crumbling. "Let's get some supplies while we wait," Roy suggested, guiding her gently toward the general store. "And maybe something to eat. It might be a long day." Inside the store, Violet moved mechanically through the aisles, barely registering what she was doing. When Mrs. Jenkins, the storekeeper's wife, approached with a sympathetic smile, Violet braced herself. "Mrs. Whittaker, such a beautiful wedding yesterday. Where's that handsome husband of yours this morning?" Before Violet could formulate a response, Roy stepped in smoothly. "Thomas had some business to attend to. We're just picking up a few things for the farm." Mrs. Jenkins looked between them, clearly curious but too polite to press further. "Well, isn't that nice of you, Mr. Anderson, helping out the newlyweds? Those night riders haven't been bothering the Novak place, have they? Heard they cut through the miller's farm last night, trampled half their wheat field." "We've had some trouble," Roy admitted, "but nothing we can't handle." As they left the store with their purchases, Violet murmured, "Thank you for that." "No need to give people more to gossip about," Roy replied simply. "You've got enough to deal with." An hour later, they met Sheriff Miller and 2 deputies at the edge of town. The Red Stallion was located about 3 miles outside Stillwater, in an area known locally as the Badlands, due to the collection of disreputable establishments that had sprung up there. As they approached the ramshackle building with its faded red sign, Violet felt a surge of apprehension. What would she find inside? What had happened to the man she'd married? "Stay close to me," Roy murmured as they dismounted. "No matter what we find in there." Violet nodded, grateful for his steady presence. Sheriff Miller led the way, pushing through the swinging doors with authority, his deputies flanking him. Despite the early hour, the Red Stallion was already active. Several card games were in progress, and the smell of cheap whiskey permeated the air. Conversations faltered as the group entered, then ceased entirely when people recognized Violet. A tall man with a waxed mustache stepped forward from behind the bar. "Sheriff," he greeted coolly, "to what do I owe this pleasure, and with such interesting company?" His eyes lingered on Violet, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Emmett Dawson," the sheriff acknowledged with a nod. "We're looking for Thomas Whittaker. Understand he's a regular at your establishment." Dawson's smirk widened. "Whittaker?" "Yes, he's been known to try his luck here. Not very successfully, I might add." His gaze shifted to Violet again. "You must be the new Mrs. Whittaker. My condolences." Roy stepped forward, his stance protective. "Where is he, Dawson? How should I know? I'm not his keeper." Dawson spread his hands in a gesture of innocence that fooled no one. "Though I will say he left here in quite a hurry yesterday, something about needing to get to his own wedding." He chuckled. "Imagine that, playing cards on your wedding day." Violet felt sick. "Was he here last night?" "After the wedding," Dawson's eyebrows rose. "After? No, can't say that he was." He paused, then added with false concern, "Are you saying your husband is missing, Mrs. Whittaker, on your wedding night? How unfortunate." There was something in his tone, a hint of knowledge that made Violet's blood run cold. "You know something," she accused. "Tell me what happened to my husband." "I know he owes me a considerable sum of money," Dawson replied, dropping all pretense of politeness. "Money I intend to collect, one way or another. If he's missing, perhaps he's simply run off to avoid his debts. It wouldn't be the first time a man has abandoned his responsibilities." Sheriff Miller stepped forward. Are you responsible for the night riders, Dawson? They've been cutting through the Novak orchard. Seems like more than coincidence. Dawson's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff. I run a legitimate business here. Legitimate businesses don't send men to terrorize innocent people, Roy said, his voice tight with anger. Careful, Cowboy, Dawson warned. Accusations like that could get a man in trouble. The tension in the room was palpable. Violet looked around desperately, searching for any sign of Thomas or any clue to his whereabouts. That's when she noticed a man in the corner watching their exchange with particular interest. When he caught her looking, he quickly averted his gaze. "Sheriff," Violet murmured, nodding subtly toward the man. Sheriff Miller followed her gaze, then turned back to Dawson. "We'll be looking into this further, Dawson. If I find out you've had anything to do with Whitaker's disappearance, you'll answer for it." "Threats, Sheriff." "That hardly seems professional," Dawson's smirk returned. "Now, if you've no other business here, I have an establishment to run." As they turned to leave, Violet noticed the man from the corner slipping out through a back door. On impulse, she tugged at Roy's sleeve. "That man," she whispered. "He knows something." Roy followed her gaze, catching a glimpse of the man just as he disappeared. Without hesitation, he took Violet's hand. "Come on," he said quietly, leading her toward the door while the sheriff continued his verbal sparring with Dawson. They slipped outside just in time to see the man mounting a horse at the back of the building. Roy quickly pulled Violet behind a stack of crates, watching as the man rode off in the direction of Stillwater. "We should follow him," Violet whispered urgently. Roy hesitated. "It could be dangerous." "We should tell the sheriff. By then he'll be gone," Violet insisted. "Please, Roy, he might lead us to Thomas." After a moment's consideration, Roy nodded. "All right, but we stay together, and at the first sign of real trouble we turn back." They hurried to their horses, mounting quickly and setting off after the mysterious man. They kept their distance, following just far enough behind to keep him in sight without being noticed. The man rode steadily, occasionally glancing over his shoulder but never seeming to spot them. Instead of heading into town, the man veered off the main road about a mile outside of Stillwater, taking a narrow trail that led toward a cluster of abandoned mining shacks that had once been part of a silver mining operation. The area had been deserted for years, the mines played out and the buildings left to decay. What would he be doing out here? Violet wondered aloud as they dismounted and tethered their horses in a small grove of trees. "Nothing good," Roy replied grimly, checking his pistol before tucking it back into his holster. "Stay behind me." They approached cautiously, using the sparse vegetation for cover. The man had disappeared into the largest of the shacks, a dilapidated structure that had once been the mining office. As they drew closer, they could hear voices from inside. "Told you to keep him quiet," someone was saying, the voice muffled through the walls. "He keeps asking about his wife," came the reply the man they had followed. "Says he needs to get back to her." "He ain't going nowhere until Dawson gets his money," the first voice declared. "Or until Novak signs over that orchard land Dawson's been wanting. Either way, our job is to keep him here and out of sight." Violet gasped, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. Thomas was alive and being held prisoner because of his gambling debts or as leverage to get her family's land. She looked at Roy, her eyes wide with fear and determination. Roy's expression was grim as he whispered, "There's at least 2 of them in there. We need to get help." "There's no time," Violet whispered back. "We don't know what they might do to Thomas." "Violet, be reasonable. We can't just—" But Violet had already made up her mind. Before Roy could stop her, she stepped out from their hiding place and walked boldly toward the shack's door. Roy cursed under his breath and hurried after her, one hand on his gun. Violet knocked firmly on the weathered door. "Hello," she called out, her voice remarkably steady considering the circumstances. "I'm looking for my husband, Thomas Whitaker." There was a sudden silence inside the shack, followed by hurried whispers. Then the door cracked open, revealing the man they had followed from the Red Stallion. His eyes widened when he saw Violet, then narrowed when he spotted Roy behind her. "You followed me," he accused. "That was a mistake." "Where's my husband?" Violet demanded, refusing to be intimidated despite her racing heart. The man glanced over his shoulder, then back at them. "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about. There's nobody here but me and Violet." Thomas's voice called from within the shack, weak but unmistakable. "Violet, is that you, Thomas?" Violet tried to push past the man, but he blocked her way, reaching for something at his waist, a gun. Before he could draw it, Roy moved with lightning speed, tackling the man and sending them both tumbling to the ground. The gun clattered away as they struggled, Roy quickly gaining the upper hand with a solid punch that left the man dazed. Violet rushed into the shack to find Thomas tied to a chair, his face bruised, a second man standing over him with a knife. When the man saw Violet, he grabbed Thomas by the hair, pressing the knife to his throat. "One more step and your husband dies," he threatened. Violet froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Roy subduing the first man. "Please," she begged, "don't hurt him." Thomas looked at her with shame-filled eyes. "I'm sorry, Violet," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." The second kidnapper tightened his grip on Thomas's hair. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to go back to your farm, get the deed to that orchard land, and bring it here. Then maybe your husband lives." "Don't do it, Violet," Thomas cried. "The land's been in your family for generations. I'm not worth." The man struck Thomas hard across the face, silencing him. "Shut up." At that moment, Roy appeared in the doorway, his gun trained on the kidnapper. "Let him go," he ordered, his voice deadly calm. "Now." The standoff lasted only seconds, but to Violet it felt like an eternity. The kidnapper's eyes darted between Roy's steady gun and the knife he held at Thomas's throat. Finally, seeing no way out, he lowered the knife and stepped back. "Smart choice," Roy said, not lowering his gun. "Violet, untie Thomas." With trembling fingers, Violet worked at the ropes binding her husband. As soon as he was free, Thomas slumped forward, clearly weakened from his ordeal. Violet supported him as best she could, her emotions a confusing mix of relief, anger, and lingering fear. Roy kept his gun trained on the kidnapper while Violet helped Thomas outside. The first man was still on the ground, groaning, his hands now tied behind his back with his own belt. Roy's quick thinking. "What do we do now?" Violet asked, looking to Roy. "We take these two and Thomas back to town," Roy decided. "Let the sheriff sort this out." He looked at Thomas with an unreadable expression. "And then I think your husband has some explaining to do." The journey back to Stillwater was tense and uncomfortable. Thomas, riding double with Violet, couldn't meet her eyes as he haltingly explained how he'd accumulated gambling debts at the Red Stallion over the past year, always believing his next win would clear what he owed. "I never meant for it to get so out of hand," he told her, his voice filled with shame. "When Dawson found out I was marrying into the Novak family, he saw an opportunity. He wants your family's orchard land, says it's perfect for some development he's planning. So he had you kidnapped to force me to sign over the land?" Violet asked, struggling to understand. Thomas nodded miserably. "Or to get me to convince you to do it? I'm so sorry, Violet. I've ruined everything." Violet didn't know what to say. The man she had married was a stranger to her, a gambling addict who had hidden his true nature throughout their courtship. She felt deceived, betrayed, and utterly lost. When they reached town, Sheriff Miller was already organizing a search party, having become concerned when Violet and Roy disappeared from the Red Stallion. He was both relieved and angry to see them, but those emotions quickly gave way to professional focus as they explained what had happened and turned over the two kidnappers. "I'll need statements from all of you," the sheriff said, "and then I'm riding back out to arrest Dawson. This is the evidence we've been waiting for to connect him to the Night Riders and the trouble they've been causing." As they gave their statements at the sheriff's office, Violet became increasingly aware of the distance growing between her and Thomas. He sat slumped in his chair, physically present but emotionally miles away, while Roy remained steadfastly by her side, offering quiet support whenever she faltered in her account of what had happened. When they finally finished, the sun was already setting. The events of the past 24 hours felt surreal to Violet, from bride to abandoned wife to rescuer, all in the span of a day. "I'll need to speak with you privately, Violet," Thomas said as they prepared to leave the sheriff's office. His voice was subdued, his eyes downcast. Violet nodded, though part of her wanted nothing more than to return to the farm with Roy, to the safety and certainty he represented. "We should go home first," she said. "It will be dark soon, and after everything that's happened." "I'll get the wagon," Roy offered, clearly reluctant to leave Violet alone with Thomas but respecting her enough to give them space. As they rode back to the Novak farm, an awkward silence filled the wagon. Thomas sat beside Violet while Roy drove. No one spoke until they reached the farmhouse, the lanterns Violet had lit the previous night still hanging on the porch, their light extinguished. Roy helped Violet down from the wagon, then turned to Thomas. "I'll check the property, make sure those night riders haven't been back," he said, his tone professional but cool. "You two should talk." As Roy walked toward the orchard, his rifle in hand, Thomas finally looked directly at Violet. "I don't know where to begin," he admitted. "What I've done, there's no excuse." Violet led the way to the porch, lighting one of the lanterns before sitting on the swing. Thomas remained standing as if unsure of his place. "Why didn't you tell me?" Violet asked, her voice quiet but steady. "About the gambling, about the debts. I thought we were starting our life together with honesty." Thomas ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I was ashamed," he confessed. "And I kept thinking I could fix it before you ever had to know. Then one debt led to another, and before I knew it, I was in too deep." He paused, then added in a rush, "I do love you, Violet. That part was never a lie." But Violet found she couldn't return the sentiment. Not now, maybe not ever again. The man she had thought she loved had never truly existed. "What happens now?" she asked instead. Thomas sighed heavily. "I don't know. Dawson won't stop coming after me after us until he gets what he wants, either the money I owe or your family's land." "So you're suggesting I give up the orchard my grandfather planted, the land my family has worked for generations?" "No," Thomas said quickly. "No, of course not. I don't know what I'm suggesting." He hesitated, then said, "Maybe it would be better if I left, got as far away from here as possible, so Dawson would have no reason to bother you or your family." The suggestion didn't surprise Violet as much as it should have. In fact, a part of her felt relief at the thought. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "What I want doesn't matter anymore," Thomas replied, a note of resignation in his voice. "I've forfeited the right to ask for anything from you. But I do want you to be safe, to have the life you deserve even if it's not with me." In the distance, Violet could see Roy making his way back from the orchard, a steady, reliable figure in the gathering darkness. She thought about the way he had stood firm against the night riders, the way he had protected her without hesitation, the way he had always been there, quietly supportive, even as she married another man. "I think you're right," she said finally, turning back to Thomas. I think it would be better if you left. Thomas nodded, accepting her decision without argument. I'll go in the morning, he said. And Violet, I truly am sorry for everything. As Roy approached the porch, Thomas stepped away from Violet, moving toward the door. I'll sleep in the spare room tonight, he said quietly. If that's all right. Violet nodded, watching as her husband of barely 24 hours entered the house alone, closing the door behind him. She remained on the porch, the single-lit lantern casting a soft glow around her. Roy stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Everything's quiet, he reported. No sign of trouble. He hesitated, then asked, Are you all right? Violet looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. Roy Anderson had been a constant in her life for 5 years, a man she had taken for granted as part of the landscape of her existence. Now she saw him anew, strong, dependable, honorable in ways Thomas Whitaker could never be. No, she answered honestly. I'm not all right. But I think someday I will be. Roy climbed the steps slowly, coming to stand near her but not too close. Thomas, he asked simply. Leaving in the morning, Violet replied. It's for the best. Roy nodded, unsurprised. What will you do? Violet gestured toward the orchard, barely visible now in the darkness. What I've always done. Take care of this land. Wait for my parents to return. Start over. You don't have to do it alone, Roy said, his voice gentle. I mean, he added hastily, I'll be here to help with the orchard, the farm work. Same as always. Something in his tone made Violet look up at him sharply. There was more he wasn't saying, emotions carefully held in check. How long had Roy Anderson carried feelings for her? How blind had she been not to notice? Thank you, Roy, she said softly, for everything. For standing firm when the night riders came, for helping me find Thomas, for being. She trailed off, uncertain how to finish. It's what anyone would have done, Roy said, though they both knew that wasn't true. Will you stay on the porch again tonight? Violet asked. Just in case they come back, Roy nodded. I'll be right here. As Violet went inside, leaving Roy to his vigil, she felt the weight of her wedding ring on her finger. She removed it slowly, placing it on the small table by the door. Her marriage had ended before it truly began, but in its collapse, she had glimpsed something else, a possibility she had never considered before. The next morning, Thomas left as promised. He took only what he had brought to the marriage, leaving behind even the wedding gifts they had received. His goodbye to Violet was brief, awkward, and tinged with regret. I'll send word when I'm settled somewhere, he told her. In case you want a divorce or annulment, whatever would be easiest for you. Violet nodded, oddly calm as she watched him mount his horse. Be careful, Thomas, she said, more out of courtesy than genuine concern. And good luck. As Thomas rode away, Roy stood respectfully off to the side, giving them privacy for their farewell. Once Thomas was out of sight, he approached Violet hesitantly. What would you like me to do today? He asked, returning to their familiar roles of employer and employee. Violet turned to him, seeing clearly the man who had been there all along. The apple trees that were damaged when the riders came through, she said. I'd like to see if we can save them. Together they walked to the orchard, to the young trees that had been trampled by the night riders. Some were beyond saving, their slender trunks snapped beyond repair. Others were bent but not broken, clinging tenaciously to life. This one might make it, Roy said, carefully straightening a sapling and securing it with stakes and twine. It'll need extra care, but it's stronger than it looks. Violet knelt beside him, helping to pack soil around the roots. Their hands touched briefly in the dirt and neither pulled away immediately. The contact was simple, undemanding, yet charged with unspoken possibility. Roy, Violet began, unsure how to express what she was feeling. "I want you to know you don't have to say anything," Roy interrupted gently. "Not now. There'll be time." And he was right, Violet realized. There would be time. Time to heal, time to discover who she was outside of her brief, failed marriage. Time to see Roy Anderson not as her father's hired hand, but as the man he truly was, the man who had stood firm while she lit lanterns to guide her way home. Over the next few weeks, a new rhythm emerged at the Novak farm. Violet's parents returned from Kansas to find their daughter's marriage dissolved almost as quickly as it had begun. They were shocked, concerned, but ultimately supportive of Violet's decision. "I never fully trusted that Whittaker fellow," her father confessed one evening. "Too smooth by half. Not like Roy. Now there's a man you can count on." Violet said nothing, but her mother noticed the flush that colored her cheeks at the mention of Roy's name. Later, in the privacy of the kitchen, Mrs. Novak approached her daughter as she prepared vegetables for dinner. "It's not too soon, you know," she said softly, "to have feelings for someone else, especially someone who's proven his worth the way Roy has." "Mother," Violet exclaimed, embarrassed. "Roy works for us. She stopped, unable to define exactly what Roy was to her now. "Mrs. Novak smiled knowingly. "He's a good man who looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, and unless I'm very mistaken, you're starting to look at him the same way." Sheriff Miller made good on his promise to arrest Emmett Dawson. With testimony from the two kidnappers, who traded information for lighter sentences, Dawson was charged not only with orchestrating the kidnapping, but also with being behind the night riders who had been terrorizing local farms. His plan, it emerged, had been to drive down land prices in the area so he could buy property cheaply for some grand development scheme. One afternoon, while Violet was hanging laundry on the line, Roy approached with news from town. "Sheriff says Dawson's been sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison," he reported, "and there's been no sign of the night riders since his arrest." "That's wonderful news," Violet said, relief evident in her voice. "Maybe now things can get back to normal around here." Roy hesitated, then said, "About that, your father spoke to me this morning, asked if I'd be interested in becoming a partner in the farm rather than just a hired hand." Violet's hand stilled on the damp sheet she was hanging. "What did you say?" "Told him I'd think about it," Roy replied, his eyes searching hers. "Wanted to talk to you first." "Me? Why?" Roy took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Because if I'm going to be a partner in this farm, I need to know where I stand with you. Things have been different between us since Thomas left. Good different, I think, but I don't want to assume." "Yes," Violet interrupted, her heart suddenly racing. "Things have been different, and yes, good different." She stepped closer to him, the laundry forgotten. "You stood by me when I needed someone most. You protected my family's land like it was your own. You showed me what kind of man you truly are, Roy Anderson." Roy reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. "I've cared for you for a long time, Violet," he admitted. "But you were Thomas's wife, or going to be, and I respected that. Even when it broke my heart to see you marry him." Violet squeezed his hand, tears welling in her eyes. "I was blind," she whispered. "So blind not to see what was right in front of me all along." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, beneath the fluttering sheets on the laundry line. When they broke apart, both were smiling, a little shy but filled with hope. "So," Roy said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, "should I tell your father yes, about the partnership?" "Yes," Violet replied without hesitation. "Yes to the partnership, and yes to whatever this is between us, whatever it might become." As summer turned to fall, the Novak orchard yielded a bountiful apple harvest. Violet and Roy worked side by side, their relationship deepening with each passing day. The damaged trees they had nursed back to health were thriving, producing their first small fruits, imperfect but sweet. When the divorce papers arrived from Thomas, who had settled in California, Violet signed them without regret. That chapter of her life was closed, a brief detour that had ultimately led her to where she was meant to be. On a crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset paint the orchard in golden hues, Roy turned to Violet with a serious expression. "I've been saving," he said, reaching into his pocket, "for years now, planning to buy my own piece of land someday." He pulled out a small velvet box. "But then I realized the only land I want is right here with you." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a small diamond catching the last rays of sunlight. "I know it hasn't been that long since Thomas," he said, his voice steady but vulnerable. "And if you need more time, I understand. But I love you, Violet Novak. I think I've loved you since the first day your father hired me and you brought me a glass of lemonade, looking at me like I was just another farmhand." Violet laughed through sudden tears. "I was 18 and thought I knew everything," she recalled. "Little did I know the man of my dreams was right there, waiting for me to grow up enough to see him." "So," Roy said, his eyes never leaving hers, "would you consider, someday when you're ready, becoming Mrs. Anderson, partner in life as well as in business?" Violet took the ring from the box, sliding it onto her finger where her wedding band from Thomas had once been. It fit perfectly, as though meant to be there all along. "I don't need someday," she said softly. "I'm ready now." Their wedding, held the following spring, was nothing like Violet's first. Instead of a church ceremony with the entire town in attendance, they exchanged vows beneath the apple trees in full bloom, with only Violet's parents and a few close friends as witnesses. Sheriff Miller, now a trusted friend, stood as Roy's best man. As Violet spoke her vows, a gentle breeze scattered apple blossoms around them like snow. She thought about the night riders who had cut through this very orchard, about the cowboy who had stood firm against them, about the bride she had been lighting lanterns in desperate hope, and the bride she was now, surrounded by love as steady and true as the man before her. That night, as husband and wife, they sat on the porch swing, looking out at their orchard. The lanterns Violet had lit on that fateful night now hung decoratively around the porch, symbols of the journey that had brought them together. "Mrs. Anderson," Roy said, testing the name like a fine wine on his tongue, "has a nice ring to it." Violet leaned against him, content in a way she had never known possible. "It does, doesn't it? Though I think the apples will still be known as Novak apples. My grandfather would haunt me otherwise." Roy laughed, pulling her closer. "Novak apples from the Anderson Novak orchard. I can live with that." As darkness fell, they remained on the porch, talking of the future they would build together, expanding the orchard, perhaps adding some livestock, definitely children someday. Their dreams were simple but solid, rooted in the land they both loved. "You ever regret it?" Roy asked suddenly. "Marrying Thomas, I mean. All the pain it caused." Violet considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "If I hadn't married him, I might never have seen you clearly. Sometimes we have to make the wrong choice before we can recognize the right one." Roy kissed her then, a kiss filled with promise and understanding. "Well, Mrs. Anderson, I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that you made the right choice this time." And she never did. In the years that followed, through droughts and bountiful harvests, through the birth of their children and the passing of Violet's parents, through all the joys and sorrows that life brought their way, Roy Anderson remained exactly what he had always been: the man who stood firm when others fled, the man who protected what he loved with unwavering devotion, the man who had waited patiently for Violet to find her way home. Their love story, born in chaos when night riders cut through the orchard and a cowboy stood firm while a bride lit lanterns, became something of a legend in Stillwater. People would point to the Novak orchard, now the most prosperous in the county, and tell newcomers, "That's what happens when love takes root in good soil." And in the center of the orchard stood a special tree the first sapling Roy and Violet had saved together after it was trampled by the night riders. It grew into the strongest, most productive apple tree on the property, its branches spreading wide, its roots deep and secure, much like the love of the couple who had tended it with such care. When their first son was born, they named him Samuel, after Violet's grandfather who had planted the original orchard. Their daughter, Emma, arrived 2 years later, followed by twins Daniel and David. The Anderson children grew up climbing the orchard trees, learning the family business from their parents, and hearing the story of how their mother and father had found each other amid danger and deception. "Your father was the bravest man in Oklahoma Territory," Violet would tell them, as Roy listened with a modest smile. "He stood against night riders with nothing but a rifle and his courage." "And your mother," Roy would add, "was the strongest woman I'd ever known, lighting lanterns in the darkness when anyone else would have given up hope." As the years passed and Stillwater grew from frontier settlement to thriving town, the Novak orchard remained its heart, a place where apple blossoms in spring gave way to rich fruit in fall, where a family's love was as deeply rooted as the trees they tended, and where, on special occasions, lanterns still glowed on the porch at night, a reminder of how light can always be found, even in the darkest of times.